Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I want to talk about the Shardblades from Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight archive series and use that as a bit of a springboard to talk about really like high-end, when I say high-end, very magical swords. There's the low-end magical swords, which just have kind of more mundane properties, but then you have really high-gear, epic fantasy magical swords with some really impressive properties. And I want to talk about those types of swords generally, hence why I'm holding Imperius here, which is the enchanted sword from my novel, Shadow of the Conqueror, because there are interesting parallels and similarities, and I think it's an example of almost, you could call it convergent evolution, but when you approach the same problem in the same way, you often reach similar conclusions. And so in regards to the Stormlight Archive series, yes, I am very familiar with it. Not only am I a big fan, I was a consultant on Stormlight Archives 4. You can look it up, go check the acknowledgements and you'll see my name there. And there are a couple of scenes in Stormlight Archives 4 that were based on some of my recommendations. There's a pretty cool scene with Adolin using a great sword, and there's even a line that I suggest that ended up being in there. So that was pretty cool. Now, this is also kind of topical because Stormlight Archives 5 is coming out, and there are some questions that I'm interested to see how Brandon handles, because the properties of Shardblades, and I'm referring here because you might notice that right here is a very rough approximate / prop of Sunraiser, which is one of the Shardblades in the Stormlight Archives. So I've made it to be as close as I could kind of make it to the reference image that is in the book, and I'll be able to use that as kind of like an example of some of the things that we're going to talk about, because it's also resting up against two other examples of very large swords. Now, Shardblades, their properties have actually changed a little bit as the series has progressed. And I want to talk about how some of those properties, those changed abilities, will actually impact the way that you would fight with them. Hence why I'm interested to see what Brandon might do in Stormlight Archives 5, which should be out like right now. And Brandon and I actually exchanged a couple of emails with some questions that he had about Stormlight Archives 5. I'm not sure if it's enough to get acknowledgement in this one, but it was actually a really good experience just sharing some thoughts back and forth. And there are some interesting things that I'm very looking forward to checking out in Stormlight Archives 5. Haven't read it yet. We're filming this before it comes out. This video is coming out with the release. And like I said, implications on how some of these Shardblades are used. Now, as a result, there will be minor spoilers in the properties of Shardblades, so you need to be aware of that going in. I will avoid spoilers as much as possible in terms of where these abilities, the change in these abilities come from. If you're familiar with the series, you'll know there's a big reason why the Shardblades used by the Knights Radiant are different from people who are just wearing Shardblade and inherited a Shardplate, and then inherited a Shardblade generally. You'll know what I'm talking about. People who are not familiar with the series won't, so I'm going to try and avoid those things, but I do need to talk about properties generally and why I think Shardblades is actually a brilliant example of the type of fantasy giant sword done right. Because in reality, a really big giant sword is incredibly impractical. You need to take some liberties to justify it, as we've discussed many times here on the channel. You need superhuman strength. That might not be enough. Sometimes you need superhuman weight to ground yourself because of the issue with torque and the fact that if the sword weighs more than you would just tip over from the point of balance being away from your center of gravity. And so that causes all issues, okay? Or you could make it out of a super light material. And so in the Stormlight Archives, Brandon actually addresses some of those things really well. The first thing I should mention, though, in regards to looking at some of the reference images, and we have Sunraiser here, it's actually not that much bigger than many historical-sized greatswords. And by the way, this just prop greatsword that I use for reference, right? They did get bigger than this. There are some crazy big greatswords that almost approach Sunraiser's size, which also means similar sizes to a lot of the other Shardblades in the Stormlight archives. And so that's actually good. You have to excuse this one. It's warped over time. I actually made it a couple of years ago. And I never got around to making the video. Now I am, so here we go. Okay, so in regards to the standard length, all right, by not going excessively big, as we've tested on the channel, by the way, all right, it does mean that Shardblades are still in a more kind of functional range. So you do need to angle it so it doesn't hit the floor, but you can do circular attacks with this, and it is actually still more usable and functional because it's not so excessively big. And you can actually do kind of parries and riposte and more complex movements, right? Oh, this is almost breaking. It's an old one now. So I can more easily demonstrate with this, but you can pretend it's a bit longer, right? You can do like some really complex motions, right? Even with a long sword. And then you have the options of doing the sweeping attacks, right? The wide-ranging motions, but you can also do upward spins. If you just keep it on an angle, this is still a very maneuverable sword, depending on its weight. But Shardblades are actually lighter than steel, if my memory serves me correctly, because that is one of the first things that you can do, which is a very simple fix to justify much larger swords. Make them out of a magical material. But there is another important question that I think is always worth addressing when you're dealing with really giant, big magical swords, is why? Why is it needed? Bigger isn't always better. There are issues that can arise when you start using really, really big swords. Maneuverability in confined spaces is a big one. You can absolutely half-sword greatswords and use it more like a spear, and suddenly this is a much more maneuverable kind of weapon in confined spaces. So there are ways to get around it, but generally it is a more awkward weapon. And it is a big, and I mean big, misconception. Many people have this, and this is perpetuated in video games, role-playing games all the time, that they perceive bigger does more damage. Not actually, okay? In terms of cutting capacity, you can have short swords, right, cut just as devastatingly as even this giant, big, greatsword, if it was real, of course, right? Because it concentrates the weight. It depends on that weight distribution, which will largely determine how much force it can drive through. And also, really long swords have an issue which probably doesn't translate often to like and I don't think it would necessarily translate to a fantasy Shardblade, but it's worth mentioning, okay? This weight is not concentrated. It's actually spread out over a pretty long section. And so when you actually strike something, okay, it actually puts a lot of stress on the blade because this part of the blade wants to continue moving down. So when you hit something with a really long sword, you can actually see it flex and kind of bounce around. That is all lost energy that's being absorbed by the flex of the blade that's actually not going into the target. If this weight was concentrated into a smaller package and you hit a target, that gets driven into the target much more efficiently. And so as a result, longer swords don't always necessarily do more damage. What they give, though, is reach. And that is such a profound, game-changing advantage. Now, in regards to Shardblades, as I mentioned, I don't think they would have that issue actually in terms of the flex and the issue with the force being kind of diluted a bit because of that. In actual fact, Shardblades can effectively chop through anything. I'll get to that ability in just a moment. I want to finish off talking about the justification for their size. Now, it does depend of course, how you intend to use it. This greatsword, not really the best pick for personal self-defense. It's a little hard to transport. We'll talk about an ability that addresses that, which is something I think is brilliant, and it's even something that I did with my own novel as well. So that is addressed, which is good, because this is so difficult to transport. It's impractical, self-defense, not necessarily good for urban combat, unless you're like maybe a bodyguard and you need to get crowd control to drive people away, all right? Yes, then there might be a urban use for a weapon like this, but generally speaking, when people opted for a weapon for personal self-defense, it would be a sidearm that would be easy to transport. But there's also the target. What are you most likely going to be fighting? Now, historically, it's mostly people. Your target is mostly... You don't often come across fantasy monsters in the real world. Unless you're online. I'm talking about trolls, but anyway, if that was too much of a deep... Not deep. Anyway, it's a stale joke. We're moving on. We're just moving past it. So, because your target is mostly humans, you only need to do enough damage that will usually incapacitate humans, which means a wide variety of weapons, short weapons, daggers, perfectly adequate for self-defense. But in a fantasy setting, you can actually have creatures that smaller arms might have a lot more difficult combating. We could compare that to certain types of animals. I mean, there's not many accounts of people trying to fight bears with daggers, but daggers actually might somewhat be decent to a bear. But okay, a dagger versus an elephant. That might be difficult. Even a greatsword, man, fighting an elephant with medieval weapons. Okay, but anyway, if your enemy is actually something that you need to do vastly more damage to, that affects the type of weapon that you would pick. Now, in my novel, the enemy are a thing, or monsters are a thing called the Shade, and they're only able to be killed by massive blood loss, big wounds, small puncture wounds doesn't affect them at all. And so the world had evolved to using much more cut-centric swords. They couldn't really use the magical swords, the Sunicles, against the Shade because of in-world reasons, except the main character. So that concept of the enemy affecting the type of weapon makes sense, and this is exactly what Brandon has done. A lot of the enemies in the Stormlight archives, specifically the monster-level enemies, are very large, and you need to be able to chop very large chunks away from them to incapacitate them. And so that question is then, what justifies the giant swords? Answered beautifully in the Stormlight archives. And this is what I like about the Stormlight archives and Shardblades. A lot of the questions, nearly all the questions, right, as to what would justify such a fantasy-style magical weapon, Brandon has approached very logically and answered. Okay, so the next thing about, what would usually limit you using such giant swords? Transportation. Brandon has answered that quite effectively, where Shardblades are actually stored inside the person. Now, in the beginning of the series, to summon the Shardblade from within yourself, it took a count of 10 heartbeats. And I actually really like that mechanic. There is a potential issue that has arisen in the later books. So this is a minor spoiler with the function of the Shardblades. I'm not going to explain how it was achieved, because there's a very specific reason why this happens. But the Knights Radiant later in the books can summon Shardblades instantly now, and they don't need a count of 10 heartbeats. Why is that significant? If you can get your sword or weapon to disappear and reappear instantly, that is a very potent tactical ability in actual combat. Especially when you're going to attack someone and they raise their sword to block, like so, and you simply make your Shardblade disappear and reappear, disappear in front, reappear underneath the blocked blade, killing him instantly. That is such a crazy powerful ability that technically the Knights Radiant would be able to do now. And so, okay, is that going to be in the book? We will see. Now, up to Stormlight Archives 4, this ability is somewhat more recent, and so perhaps the characters haven't trained with it yet. But the reason why I loved the 10 heartbeat rule is that answered it completely. If you make the Shardblade disappear and know that you have to wait a certain amount of time before it to reappear, you're disarming yourself for a good chunk of the period of time in the battle, which could be suicide. No one would ever do it, really, because of that. You don't want to disarm yourself in the fight. But now, because Shardblades can be summoned instantly, it becomes a utility ability in combat. Or, here's an interesting thing that and look, I know it's too late to offer suggestions, but this is perhaps how I would probably approach the situation, is that when, let's just call a enhanced Shardblade, there's an actual reason why they can do this, okay, which is related to something else, but I'm just going to call them an enhanced Shardblade. There could be a mechanic, or could have been a mechanic, in which when an enhanced Shardblade makes contact with another Shardblade, enhanced or not, it causes a type of attraction between the two, or brings the ability that summons the weapon into reality. It kind of solidifies them or pulls them into that state more firmly for a couple of seconds every time it makes contact with another Shardblade, which delays your ability to, dismiss the blade, make it dissipate. And you could have a timer. It's like as soon as a Shardblade makes contact with another Shardblade, solidifying it, pulling it into reality more, it then can't be dismissed for... It could be up to 1 minute, 5 minutes. It's actually open mechanic here that you could even do it half an hour or something like that, which could kind of be funny. Is like, minor spoiler, and some of these blades can have sentient abilities. All right, being able to communicate with the user, and the blade could just be really annoyed that they're locked in that state. It's like, you're frozen me in this state. I don't. Anyway. But that's the type of way that I would approach it. Now, I don't know if that will be the way... And by the way, I haven't read Stormlight Archives 5. Brandon has already preempted something like that in the book. Props to him. Minds thinking alike and the association... There's a phrase there. Anyway, okay, so still, that answers the issue of transportation. Remember, it's like these swords are really big. If you can just make them dissipate and they're stored magically inside yourself. Shardblades also have another really interesting ability, and it's similar to one that I have for a character that I wrote years ago, right? And it's that they only actually cut through non-living material. And so they can cut stone like it's nothing, trees in half, armor in half. But when they strike a person, it doesn't cut the person, but almost like cuts their soul, and their limb kind of goes dead. And if they're cut around the neck, paralyzing them. And really interesting. So if someone was wearing armor and you slash through them with a Shardblade, the armor would just have a big gash separating it, but the person wouldn't actually be cut. They would just fall almost lifeless. That is just a really interesting, different kind of approach as to the damage that these magical swords can do that I like. There's not too much to mention about that in terms of the mechanics of it. I think it works really well in the story, but their ability to cut through anything is actually, like, in terms of other uses for that, is considered by one of the characters, Dalinar, when he's carving out a latrine in solid stone with his Shardblade, and he realizes, like, this is also a useful tool. That actually would be, like, the uses of this type of weapon in extended, applications does have that, and I love that, that was addressed in the book. There is another ability in Enhanced Shardblades, which is a bit of a game changer now. Slight spoiler again, won't explain how it can be done, but now Enhanced Shardblades can actually morph and alter their shape, even lengthening and shortening their blades, even adopting completely different forms. It could turn to a spear, it could turn to a shield, it could turn to a shorter sword, a long sword, and it is now, like Shardblades with the enhanced versions, are morphable weapons even in the middle of combat. Characters do use that in combat. I'm glad they do, because that is a really crazy ability where a character is switching between a sword, then goes to a spear, then back to then a shield at times. And that is wicked. That is great, okay? It is, again, one of those abilities that need to be considered very, you need to approach it with awareness, and remember that's always something that can be done. Because if you're just standing, in a defensive position, and you can just shoot the blade forward, it's become essentially like a ranged weapon. I don't know what the limits of that morphing ability is. How long can you make a Shardblade now? It's not based on volume, because they can adopt actually much smaller blades and much bigger ones, and the bigger ones clearly have a greater volume than their shorter configurations, and so that doesn't seem like that's a limiting factor. But there needs to be some type of limit on it, because what can you make the blade 100 meters long? A kilometer long? And then if it's like that big, you could chop a mountain in half. I'm really intrigued about that mechanic now, to see what the extent of it is. could chop a mountain. It has crazy applications, all right? But I do love the fact that it adds a huge amount of versatility in combat. In actual fact, that ability would become the primary almost training thing. In two things, actually. The ability to make the weapon disappear and reappear instantly, and its ability to morph into any shape. You would never just train with the Shardblade now as a single static weapon. The training drills would actually involve combos which switch it up entirely, where you would go through maybe 2 attacks with a sword configuration, it morphs into a spear, you go into a thrust, and then you would, I don't know, do a version where it morphs into a shield. Maybe if you need a really heavy attack like an axe and stuff like that, and you would actually train with the morphing ability, and a Shardblade wouldn't actually just settle on a sword. Interestingly enough, most people use swords, have their Shardblades in the configuration of swords, because the enemies they're fighting, because the enemies having a wide cutting ratio justifies them being in sword configuration a lot. Okay, that's good. But when you're fighting another opponent, the weapon that you would have the Shardblade adopt more often when fighting other opponents is the one that usually rises to the top in terms of many weapon comparisons. It's the spear. The spear is such a crazy powerful weapon, primarily the reach ability. And by the way, there is a certain main character in the series that loves the spear as his primary weapon, which is very, very true. And he fights with the Shardblade in spear form, often enough in combat with other opponents. And yeah, see, Bren is a smart guy. There's a reason why I really like him as an author. And he approaches a lot of these factors to consider in a similar way that I do, which I appreciate. I think a lot of other, people who have, enhanced Shardblades would also end up adopting a spear in combat with other people a lot. I mean, a lot. Getting it to morph into a shield where it's like a guaranteed block, good option. Gosh, there are some things in the Stormlight Archives universe that can block a Shardblade. Not much. And I'm really intrigued in shields. If they can create shields that can block Shardblades, that the people who use them would then not have to morph their weapon into a shield. They just have a regular shield and then combine that with spear, blade, and everything. And that would be a potent combination. But of course, when they're fighting the big monsters, big cutting ratio, chopping limbs off and or incapacitating limbs and other attacks, yeah, it makes sense that a lot of the Shardblades got stuck in the blade configuration. And so that's basically been the overall analysis of Stormlight Archive Shardblades and why they're such a great example of big giant fantasy weapons done right. Here's addressed just kind of in summary, justification for them being so big, the issues with transportation, the potential issues with cutting ratio. They have magical cutting abilities. Remember, they can be stored, and the big monsters justify the size. But then they have those additional abilities that, like, if people are approaching it logically, there's just some clear uses that I'm intrigued to see if that is handled in the upcoming book. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think about the Shardblades in the comments below. And genuinely, if you haven't checked out the Stormlight Archives, look, it's a big, thick, epic fantasy book. And so if you're not used to that level type of fantasy, you can start out with maybe Mistborn or even perhaps Shadow the Conqueror, my novel. But it's such a great series. I highly recommend it. And go check it out if you haven't seen it. And also, go check out this video where I talk about other properties of magical swords. Some abilities I think are really cool and are very, very useful. So go check it out. Hope to see you there. And until then, farewell.